It's Friday, the 11th of November, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh, Cardiff and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Susan Hume. On the programme this week, Rishi Sunak is criticised for appointing Gavin Williamson to the Cabinet.
I did not know about any of the specific concerns relating to his conduct as Secretary of State or Chief Whip.
He's a pathetic bully. But he would never get away with it if people like the Prime Minister didn't hand him power.
Questions for the Prime Minister on the UK's path to net zero.
The Prime Minister said in his speech at COP27 that we need to act faster on renewables. So why is he the roadblock at home?
He needs to live in the real world, Mr. Speaker. Oil and gas are going to be a part of our energy mix.
Concerns for LGBTQ fans in the run-up to the World Cup.
The Qatar FIFA World Cup ambassador Khalid Salman has described homosexuality as damage in the mind and has said he is worried that children may learn something that is not good from the presence of LGBTQ plus people in the World Cup.
And MPs back the campaign for Jade's law.
Jade's mother, Karen, said she was absolutely gobsmacked to hear that her daughter's killer could still have a say in the boys' lives.
Well, let's start with events here at Westminster with Susan Hume. Susan, Rishi Sunak has faced a lot of criticism about his cabinet appointments. First it was Suella Braverman and now Gavin Williamson.
That's right. In fact, Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, was sitting on the front bench next to Rishi Sunak at Prime Minister's questions, looking very grave, but inwardly she must have been pretty relieved that it was somebody else who was the focus of attention this week, and it was Sir Gavin Williamson. Like Suella Braverman, he'd had to resign previously from the Cabinet but was brought back by Rishi Sunak. However, just a couple of weeks into the job, allegations of bullying against him emerged from a fellow MP and from a civil servant. He resigned quickly on Tuesday night, but of course that wasn't enough to stop him being the focus of Keir Starmer's questions at Prime Minister's Question Time. Now, I think it's fair to say that over the years, Gavin Williamson has sometimes cultivated the image of a pantomime villain with that tarantula in his office when he was... That's right, Cronus, when he was Chief Whip. And of course, you know, that was good for Keir Starmer. He maxed out on that. I should also say, before we take a look, MPs can't refer to each other by name. So the member for South Staffordshire is Sir Gavin Williamson, and we'll also hear about the member for Islington North. That's the former Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, now an independent.
Mr. Speaker, the member for South Staffordshire told a civil servant to slit their throat. How does the Prime Minister think the victim of that bullying felt when he expressed great sadness at his resignation?
Mr. Speaker, unequivocally the behaviour complained of was unacceptable, and it is absolutely right. It is absolutely right that the right honourable gentleman has resigned. For the record, I did not know about any of the specific concerns relating to his conduct as Secretary of State or Chief Whip, which date back some years. I believe that people in public life should treat others with consideration and respect, and those are the principles that this government will stand by.
Mr. Speaker, the member for South Staffordshire spent years courting the idea he can intimidate others, blurring the lines to normalise bullying behaviour. It's precisely why the Prime Minister gave him a job. The truth is simple. He's a pathetic bully. but he would never get away with it if people like the Prime Minister didn't hand him power. So does he regret his decision to make him a government minister?
Mr. Speaker, I obviously regret appointing someone who has had to resign in these circumstances. But I think what the British people would like to know is that when situations like this arise, that they will be dealt with properly. And that's why it is absolutely right that he resigned, and it's why it is absolutely right that there is an investigation to look into these matters properly. I said my government would be characterised by integrity, professionalism and accountability, and it will.
Mr. Speaker, the problem is he can't stand up to a run-of-the-mill bully. So he has no chance of standing up to vested interests on behalf of working people. Take Shell. They made record profits this year, £26 billion. How much have they paid under his so-called windfall tax?
Mr. Speaker, I was Chancellor who introduced an extra tax on the oil and gas companies. Right, but he talks, Mr. Speaker, he talks about working people. The Right Honourable Member voted against legislation to stop strikes disrupting working people. He voted against legislation to stop extremist protesters disrupting working people. That's because he's not on the side of working people, Mr. Speaker. That's what the Conservatives are for.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pattern with this Prime Minister. Too weak to sack the security threat sat around the Cabinet table. Too weak to take part in a leadership contest after he lost the first one. Too weak to stand up for working people. He spent weeks flirting with the climate change deniers in his party, then scuttled off to COP at the last minute. In the budget next week, he'll be too weak to end his oil and gas giveaway, scrap the non-dom tax breaks, and end the farce of taxpayers subsidising private schools. That's what Labour would do, a proper plan for working people. Mr. Speaker, if he can't even stand up to a cartoon bully with a pet spider, if he's too scared to face the public in an election, what chance has he got of running the country?
The honourable gentleman talks about judgment about putting people around the Cabinet table. I would just generally remind him he thought the member for Islington North was the right person to look after our security. But, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman, he said a lot today. But it's clear that he isn't focused on the serious issues that are confronting our country. We're strengthening our economy. He's backing the strikers. We're supporting people with energy bills. He's supporting the protesters. And we're tackling illegal migration. He's opposing every measure. The British people want real leadership on the serious global challenges we face, and that's what they'll get from this government.
Last night, the Prime Minister suffered the self-inflicted loss of his first Cabinet Minister. A couple of weeks into the job, it turns out this Prime Minister's judgment is every bit as bad as his predecessors. Speaking of which, we now know that his former friend, the former Prime Minister, plans to hand out seats in the House of Lords to at least 4 Tory MPs, including the current Secretary of State for Scotland. So here's another test of judgment for the new Prime Minister. Does he think it right to keep a man in a cabinet who's clearly far more interested in getting his hands on an ermine robe than playing by the rules of Scottish democracy?
Mr. Speaker, I'm obviously not going to comment on speculation around such lists. Any list would, of course, follow the normal procedures and processes that are in place.
As we just heard from Sir Keir Starmer, much has been made of the Prime Minister's U-turn on attending the COP climate summit this week. He did go in the end, didn't he? And he made a statement to the Commons on Wednesday.
Yes, in a rather calmer atmosphere than we saw at Prime Minister's questions there. It is usual for Prime Ministers to make these kind of statements back to MPs after they've been to these big international summits. It's interesting, isn't it? Because, our own experience of extreme weather, of flooding, of the extreme temperatures we had in the summer, and you see on the TV extreme weather events that are made more likely by climate change. And such a contrast between the language of these summits, where people talk about targets and mitigations, and something that came up a lot at this one was loss and damage. Hugely controversial. That's where underdeveloped or less developed countries want reparation money from countries like the UK, who've got rich over the past 150 years or so from industry and burning fossil fuels.
We will accelerate our transition to renewables, which have already grown fourfold as a proportion of electricity supply over the last decade. We will invest in building new nuclear power stations for the first time since the 1990s. And by committing £30 billion to support our green industrial revolution, we will leverage up to £100 billion of private investment to support almost 500,000 high-wage, high-skilled green jobs.
The Prime Minister said in his speech at COP27 that we need to act faster on renewables. So why is he the roadblock at home? As he was flying to Egypt, his minister was reaffirming the ban on onshore wind, the cheapest, cleanest form of power that we have. The Prime Minister also said at COP27 that he realises the importance of ending our dependence on fossil fuels. But he's inserted a massive oil and gas giveaway when Labour forced him into a windfall tax.
He needs to live in the real world, Mr. Speaker. Oil and gas are going to be a part of our energy mix in the transition for the several years ahead, and it's simply pie in the sky to pretend otherwise. The Independent Committee on Climate Change has even recognised that.
Can I ask the Prime Minister if he will guarantee that UK overseas aid earmarked for climate finance will be spent within the 5-year timeframe as originally promised? And can he also guarantee that the total aid budget won't be slashed further in the autumn statement next week?
With regard to our international climate finance pledges, as I said, we remain committed to the £11.6 billion. It is our intention to deliver it over the time frame that was originally envisaged. And with regard to targets, again, it should be a source of enormous pride for everyone in this House that we have decarbonised in this country faster than any other G7 country.
The Prime Minister just said how important it is to keep our promises on climate finance, and I agree with him. Can he explain why he doesn't seem to agree with himself, since his government hasn't kept its climate promises? He's not delivered the $300 million that we still owe to the Green Climate and Adaptation Funds. When are we going to see that? Will he ensure that all new climate finance is new and additional, not being raided from an ever-diminishing aid budget? And finally, does he recognise that the moral obligation that he talks about must now extend beyond mitigation and adaptation to address loss and damage? And specifically, will he support the establishment of a finance facility for loss and damage at COP27?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've already made the point on loss and damage that we established the Glasgow dialogue to see how best to take forward those discussions. I'm not going to preempt the discussions that are happening at COP, but I would make the point that this is not the same as reparations. I think the Honourable Lady understands that, but that is not what is on the table, and that is clear in the language that's being debated at COP.
Thank you, Susan. More from you later. Well, let's find out what's been happening in the Scottish Parliament now. Our correspondent Lindsay Bewes is at Holyrood. Lindsay, A&E waiting times are the worst on record in Scotland this week, and that issue has been raised in Parliament.
Yeah, that's right, Ben. The latest figures out this week show that around 63% of people were seen within 4 hours. Now, the Scottish Government's target is for 95% of people to be seen within that time. Now, the level has been below 80% since the summer, and that has been putting increasing pressure on the Health Secretary, Hamza Yousaf, with the Lib Dems raising this issue in an urgent question in Parliament this week.
This isn't the fault of clinicians or emergency care workers. They're working their hearts out. When the Health Secretary took office in May 2021, A&Es were able to see 87% of patients within those 4 hours. Today, that stands at just 63.1%, the worst on record. And it gets worse when you look at the longest waits. The number of patients waiting over 8 hours has gone up 717%. Waits of over 12 hours have gone up more than 1,000%. All of this, presiding officer, is on his watch. So does the Health Secretary think that he is the best person to resolve this crisis? And is he saying that there is nobody at all, who could do this job better than him?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, what I would say to Alice Hamilton is that when I took office, of course, we still had legal restrictions because of COVID. We no longer have those legal restrictions, and therefore people are able to interact. Therefore, our services are able to recover in the NHS. They weren't. We didn't have elective care. We had paused elective care effectively at the time I took office. And of course, when I took office, since then, we've had not one, not two, not 3, but 4 waves of COVID. And this is the point that, of course, Alex Hamilton in his tirade forgot to mention, is that we are still in the midst of that global pandemic. So while the opposition may want to concentrate on personalities, they can do that. My relentless focus is on the front line, on those working in our NHS, because what they deserve is not a game of personality politics or using the NHS as the political football. What they deserve is, of course, government, but also every single one of us in opposition, ensuring that we come forward with constructive solutions that are going to help our NHS at what is the most difficult time. And that's why my relentless focus, as I say, is on the NHS and those working on the front line, for which I'm very, very grateful for all their efforts every day, day in and day out.
Now, the NHS here, like in other parts of the UK, is facing an array of difficulties, and those issues are all interconnected. So, for example, delays in people leaving hospital is having a knock-on effect to A&E waiting time. So that is what Scottish ministers are grappling with, and they have already been warning that the NHS is facing a very tough winter ahead.
And Lindsay, the NHS was a theme at First Minister's questions too. What's been the reaction to nurses backing industrial action?
Yeah, that's right. Both the Scottish Conservative and Scottish Labour leaders raised this at FMQs. Nurses voting for strike for the first time ever over pay, and also raising concerns about the conditions facing patients in the NHS. Now, Scottish Labour leader Anna Sarwar broadened that out to the wider staffing problems the health service is facing. He said that that was as a result of decisions that have been taken over the past 10 years. Now, the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, standing in for Nicola Sturgeon this week, then pointed to comments made by Sir Keir Starmer, the UK Labour leader, that there were too many people from overseas being recruited into the health service.
What I don't think helps the situation is the comments made at the weekend by the leader of the United Kingdom Labour Party, who said, I think we're recruiting too many people from overseas into, for example, the health service. I listened to those comments with incredulity, because what is hampering us in the National Health Service is the Brexit that was inflicted on us by the Conservatives, ending free movement of individuals, which has lost members of staff from our National Health Service. We need to reverse that. We need to have an approach that is open to migration so we can boost the recruitment into our National Health Service. And the comments from Keir Starmer are a disastrous signal to give to hard-working members of staff.
Let me be clear. Migrants play an invaluable part in our NHS, and they always have done and they always would do. And I would also say people that come and work in our NHS are not migrants. They're equal Scots, just like the rest of us. But that should not stop us having a credible workforce plan that means we train more doctors and nurses here. Now, the First Minister has rightly been calling in the last few days for more action on loss and damage on climate change. So we should not pretend that taking nurses and doctors from developing countries does not cause loss and damage to healthcare systems in those countries. So let's not create a climate of fear. Let's not change and play on that rhetoric that's beneath the Deputy First Minister, and let's actually talk about what's happening here right now in the SNP's watch.
Anna Sarwar seeking to distance himself there from those remarks from Sir Keir Starmer, and attempting to add a bit of nuance to this too, talking about the moral questions of taking skilled workers from other countries and the impact it could have on their health services. But I think those comments from Sir Keir Starmer really giving the Scottish Government a very clear line of attack this week.
Yeah, and there's also been scrutiny of legislation to set up a national care service in Scotland. What's that about?
Well, the Scottish Government has published legislation that would allow ministers to take responsibility for social care away from councils and put it into a new national service. Now, this bill is a framework bill with the details due to be added in secondary legislation, but that has caused a lot of concerns about a lack of information on how this would work and the overall costs as well, with opposition MSPs saying ministers are effectively writing a blank cheque for this policy, and that was raised at the Finance Committee this week.
It is surely incumbent upon the Scottish Government to set out as much detail as it possibly can to help us along the way to persuade us that the change that the Scottish Government wants to make is not just desirable from the laudable aims that you've set out, but is actually workable and deliverable. And at the moment, we have far too many people around the country telling us that they have serious concerns about what it is that they will be asked to do to make that work, and certainly whether the costs are applicable. Do you accept at least that there is very genuine concern, and that's another reason why this bill should be paused for the time being?
I do not think the bill should be paused. I know that some folks are opposed to the change that we're trying to make here. I think that there are concerns. We will talk to folk, listen to folk about their concerns and work our way through with them.
Now, the National Care Service is an SNP manifesto policy. It is a flagship policy for the Scottish Government, and Minister is very clear that they are going to press ahead with it. But it is early days, and a lot of detail is going to have to be fleshed out over the coming weeks and months. Now, the Scottish Government says that it wants to get this new National Care Service up and running by 2026. But even those working within the care sector are saying that that timescale is very ambitious indeed.
Lindsay Bewes at Holyrood, thank you very much. Well, let's return to Westminster and catch up with our correspondent, Susan Hume. In Northern Ireland, there has been no government at Stormont since February, but there was an update this week. What's the latest?
Well, just to recap first, there's been no government all that while at Stormont because of the post-Brexit agreement with the EU, the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, the DUP absolutely hate that. The reason being, it means that there are some checks on goods traded across the Irish Sea, in effect making a border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. Sinn Féin say that also the DUP are not very keen on going back into power sharing because they'd have to play second fiddle to Sinn Féin this time round. However, as you say, there has been a bit of movement. It looks like there could be a deal with the EU on the horizon. So the Northern Ireland Secretary has said he wants to postpone the inevitable elections to see if there can be a deal before that. And also he said that he doesn't want Assembly members to get their full pay until they're back at work.
We must try and find a way through this current impasse, where I have a legal duty to call an election that few want and everyone tells me will change nothing. Thus, I will be introducing legislation to provide a short, straightforward extension to the period for executive formation, extending the current period by 6 weeks to the 8th of December, with a potential for a further 6-week extension to the 19th of January, if necessary. This aims to create the time and space needed for talks between the UK Government and the European Commission to develop, and for the Northern Ireland parties to work together to restore the devolved institutions as soon as possible.
Power sharing, as frustrating as it can be, is the essential and hard-won outcome of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and the principle of consent is fundamental to it. The fact that we have been without an executive since February damages that agreement that we all cherish. It has also hit public finances. The Independent Fiscal Council has been clear that the lack of executive has made it harder to manage the pressure of inflation. The cost of living crisis is hitting Northern Ireland particularly hard. The government must urgently implement the support it has promised. If the government delays any further, it must give the people of Northern Ireland an explanation beyond simply saying that it's complicated.
given the impasse that we are in, and given the more than desperate requirement for functioning devolution for the people of Northern Ireland at a time of high inflation, interest rates and cost of living, surely in the 21st century, no one party should have a veto on devolution.
We recognise that the Government has brought forward legislation on the protocol. That is welcome. And that negotiations are ongoing. Can I just say to the Secretary of State that the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement is based upon the principle of consensus, cross-community support. And when I hear some members in this House saying that no one party should have a veto and praising the Good Friday Agreement, maybe they need to read the agreement again and recognise that it's cross-community. And the silence from some, when Sinn Féin held no government in Northern Ireland for 3 years, they kept us without a government, and nothing was said. Nothing was said about removing the Sinn Féin veto. So let's be even-handed in this. And I, in conclusion, say to the Secretary of State, words like courage, understanding and compromise are fine and good words. But what the people of Northern Ireland need now, and the sooner the better, is a solution that sees the institutions restored on the basis that Northern Ireland is an integral part of the United Kingdom, in line with Article 1 of the Belfast Agreement and in line with the Act of Union itself.
Can I just say at the outset that I was never quiet when Sinn Féin kept the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement down, and I will challenge any party who tries to stop the wishes of the people of Northern Ireland being properly implemented. Can I thank the Secretary of State for recognising that an election at this time is a bad idea, would make things worse rather than better, and recognise that there have to be arrangements put in place in the absence of an executive. But does he agree with me that it is actually pretty shameful that in the middle of winter, when people and businesses are panicking about their bills, we have one party who are stopping a government being formed in Northern Ireland so that we can deal with those issues? Surely now is the time to put these arrangements aside, to have the DUP Deputy First Minister go into Stormont and have an executive to deal with the priorities of the people.
And Susan, the government has been under pressure too about the overcrowding situation at the asylum processing centre at Manston in Kent, hasn't it? Has there been any improvement there this week?
Yes, there has. Manston is a holding centre, meant to be a temporary holding centre for people who've just arrived on those small boats across the Channel seeking asylum. It had got very overcrowded, leading to claims that the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, had failed in her obligation to sort out onward accommodation for people. However, the Immigration Minister came along this week to say that the situation had greatly improved. There were still worries from MPs, though, some saying that they were concerned about what happened to these asylum seekers next, and some concerns from people who said the hotel accommodation they were being put up in was actually better than their constituents had.
I can tell the House that as of 8 a.m. this morning, the population at the Manston facility was back below 1,600. This is a significant reduction from this point last week, with over 2,300 people being placed in onward accommodation.
Manston is a processing centre and not accommodation centre. Would he therefore agree with me that the temporary facilities that were erected while he and I were both there present a week ago on Sunday will be demolished? And can he confirm that additional accommodation will be provided so that the spike in November, which is anticipated and which will happen, as it happened last year, will be catered for so that we won't have a repetition of the clogging up of the facilities at Manston?
I'll take note of his comment that he would like the temporary facilities there to be dismantled. I don't think that that is possible right now, because the prudent thing is to ensure that we maintain the level of infrastructure we have in case there's a significant increase in the number of migrants arriving in the weeks ahead.
The former Home Secretary revealed today that on the 20th of October he received legal advice that Manston was being used or in danger of being used as a detention centre, and he took emergency measures to work within the law. However, the current Home Secretary met with officials on the 19th of October, just before she was forced to resign for breaching the ministerial code. Can the Minister please confirm that she refused to take those same emergency emergency measures? And can he explain why she ignored the advice she was repeatedly given over a period of several weeks? The Home Secretary told this House just a week ago that she did not ignore legal advice. Can the Minister tell the House now whether he believes that statement to be correct?
The Home Secretary has consistently approved hotel accommodation. More than 30 hotels have been brought online in the time that my right honourable friend has been in office, and that has ensured that thousands of asylum seekers have been able to move on from the Manston site and into better and more sustainable accommodation. And look at her record over the course of the last week. The population at Manston has fallen from 4,000 individuals to 1,600 in the matter of 7 days. That is a very considerable achievement.
The question for my right honourable friend is not how many hotels we can book. It is stopping the increase in migrants coming across the Channel this year. We've seen over 10,000 adult males from Albania, aged 18 to 40, between 1 and 2% of the population coming to the United Kingdom. We will not have enough hotels in the United Kingdom if it continues at this rate.
There is this concern about the legality of the Home Secretary's actions in authorising individuals to be detained at Manston for over 24 hours, and weekend media reports suggested that the Home Secretary was repeatedly provided with advice that detaining individuals at Manston for over 24 hours was illegal, and the Sunday Times reports on the 4th of October the Home Secretary received papers stating that the Home Office had no power to detain people solely for welfare reasons or for arranging onward accommodation.
There are competing legal duties upon us as ministers. Another legal duty that we need to pay heed to is our duty not to leave individuals destitute. And I think it would be wrong for the Home Office to allow individuals who've only recently arrived in the United Kingdom, and bearing in mind that the vast majority of those at Manston have literally been saved at sea by Border Force, by the RNLI and the Royal Navy, and brought there in a condition of some destitution. It would not be right for us just to release those people onto the rural lanes of Kent without great care.
My constituents are becoming sick and tired of this ridiculous narrative of economic migrants somehow being mistreated at Manston. The facts of the matter are that after a short time at the processing centre, these economic migrants will receive free food and free accommodation in hotels, something my constituents who are paying for all of this could only dream of. How does he think my constituents who can't get an NHS dentist or a GP appointment or a council house feel about the fact that we're spending £2 billion a year on hotel bills because we can't be bothered to solve this issue?
An issue we'll be hearing more about in the Commons, I am sure. Thank you, Susan. Well, let's go to Cardiff now, where our reporter Rhiannon Wilkins can tell us what's been happening in the Welsh Parliament. Rhiannon, the First Minister hasn't been working this week because he's got coronavirus.
Yes, that's right. So the Trefnydd, which is the equivalent to the Leader of the House, Lesley Griffiths, stood in for First Minister's questions, where the Welsh Government's attendance at the World Cup was a big focus. First Minister Mark Drakeford and the Economy Minister Vaughan Gething are going to the World Cup, but that's putting them at odds with the UK Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer, who's boycotting the tournament because of Qatar's human rights record. Now, the leader of the Welsh Conservatives here, Andrew R.T. Davies, is usually very quick to criticise any decisions made by the Welsh Government, but on this occasion, he says that he thinks Mark Drakeford is right to go and Sir Keir Starmer is wrong.
You are the only Labour government in any part of the United Kingdom, and rightly you are going to celebrate Wales' success being on that international stage. Why are you right and he wrong?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of right and wrong. We are in government, as you point out, and I think it is different from a government politician's point of view than it is for somebody in opposition. The UK Labour Party has not called for formal government boycotts, for instance. I think he and we recognise the very different positions of politicians that I've just explained. I think the UK Labour, and I don't know if the Leader of Opposition has picked this up, but they've made it very clear that they absolutely believe it is right and proper that the Welsh Government do promote Wales on a global stage. It's the first time Wales men's team has been at a World Cup finals for 64 years, and they certainly believe that they should attend as official representatives.
But in stark contrast to Andrew R.T. Davies, the leader of Plaid Cymru, Adam Price, asked if the First Minister would reconsider going to the World Cup because of the country's LGBTQ+ rights. Adam Price said that he, as a gay man, felt that it would be inappropriate for Mark Drakeford to go because it could be sending, or it would be sending out the wrong message. Adam Price also said that he was concerned about the safety of the Rainbow Wall. The Rainbow Wall is the Wales squad's LGBTQ+ fan base.
The Qatar FIFA World Cup ambassador Khalid Salman has described homosexuality as damage in the mind and has said he is worried that children may learn something that is not good from the presence of LGBTQ+ people in the World Cup. You refer to the Rainbow Wall. Of course, they're deciding that they cannot go to this World Cup. I've seen discussion that the Football Association of Wales is having with the Qatar government about creating safe houses for LGBTQ+ people. But the fact that even there has to be that discussion and that there can be no guarantee ultimately that LGBTQ+ people will not be subject to discrimination and indeed even imprisonment, I think shows the gravity of the situation that we're facing. So in the light of these most recent comments, will the First Minister be potentially reconsidering his intention to attend?
So I can't answer the question as to whether the First Minister will be reconsidering his attendance, because obviously I'm unable to speak to him. He's unwell, but I'm sure his office will have heard your question, so I don't really feel I can answer that.
Well, the Welsh Government's defended its position going to the World Cup, saying it won't be turning a blind eye to human rights abuse, and says that it's been talking to LGBTQ+ fans and trade unions about safety. But the issue of going to the World Cup is certainly causing quite a stir. The Labour MP for Rhondda, Chris Bryant, has also spoken out saying he doesn't think that the Welsh Government should go, and I don't think that this topic will quieten down over the coming weeks either.
And attendance at the World Cup wasn't the only big event being discussed and scrutinised.
That's right. As COP27 continues in Egypt, climate change has been a focus here in Cardiff Bay too. Here in the Welsh Government, the Cabinet has a climate change minister and a deputy climate change minister, but no Welsh Government ministers are going or intend on going to COP27. Plaid Cymru's Delyth Jewell asked the climate change minister, Julie James, why this decision had been made.
We thought very carefully about whether I should go to COP27 or indeed the First Minister should go. But I'm actually attending COP15 in Canada, the biodiversity COP, which is a decision-making COP. And given the sort of carbon footprint of going all over the place, and given that this isn't a decision-making COP, it's an implementation COP, we have a team of officials out there working on the implementation side of it. But we thought the black platform was better used at COP15.
So, to summarise, the Welsh Government's attendance or lack of attendance at world events, a common theme this week and being scrutinised at every turn.
Rhiannon Wilkins at the Senedd, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's turn back to Susan Hume, who is here. This week, both Labour and Conservative MPs have been calling on the government to introduce what's called Jade's Law. What's that about?
Yeah, this is part of a campaign brought about by the family of Jade Ward. Now, she was murdered by her estranged husband who'd got into the house and killed her while their 4 children slept in a room nearby. A terrible case. He's been convicted and jailed, but her family were then absolutely appalled to discover that he still had joint parental responsibility over those 4 children. And that meant he had a veto over things like whether they could go abroad, a say in their education or medical things. Now, they say that that is a way in which a parent who's murdered another parent continues to exert a malicious control over the family. You can go to court and wrest that parental control away from the person, but that's quite a big process for a bereaved family. And they say they want it to be the other way around, that if someone murders their partner, then their parental rights are suspended immediately, and the onus is then on the perpetrator to go to court and try to get those rights back.
Despite all his appalling actions, under law, he still retains parental responsibility. Jade's mother, Karen, said she was absolutely gobsmacked to hear that her daughter's killer could still have a say in the boys' lives. Now, we often see domestic abuse as physical violence, which it is in many cases, but at its root is control. It is about controlling their so-called partner. And to give that person still that control from the prison cell must give that person, that perpetrator, a real buzz. Currently, the onus is on the family to prove why Marshy's parental responsibility should be revoked or restricted, whereas Jade's law calls for parental responsibility to be automatically suspended in circumstances such as these, putting the onus on the killer to go through the legal hoops of proving they deserve parental responsibility, freeing the victim's family of the traumatic burden that they currently carry. As Jade's mother said, we're going through enough without having him looming over our heads.
Services supporting victims might tell them they're safe once their former partner is in prison, but this isn't always the case. Children heard and seen say allowing a violent offender parental responsibility gives them the opportunity to control their child, ex-partner or family from within the prison walls. One mother applied for passports to take her children on holiday after a difficult few years leading up to their father's imprisonment. But because both parents had parental responsibility, she needed his signature to complete the application. He was given the paperwork by the prison officers and he refused to sign it. That meant the family couldn't travel and the mother lost every penny she'd paid towards the holiday.
I'm proud to stand here today and say that a Labour government would put Jade's law onto the statute books. Whilst nothing can make up for the loss of Jade, we can make sure she did not die in vain. We can make this change and ensure that the rights of children and the victim's family are valued over those of the abuser.
We believe it's right to limit the parental responsibility of those who hold it if deemed to be in the welfare and best interests of the child. And it's right, though, that that is a power exercised by the courts and that they have those powers at their disposal to make these orders. I will consider very carefully and further reflect on the points that have been made in today's debate and will offer, if he wishes to take me up on it, to meet with the Right Honourable Gentleman, with the Lord Bellamy as the lead for family law in the department, and if he will allow me to join that meeting as the Victims Minister, I would be very happy to meet with him to further discuss.
And before we go, Susan, what are we expecting to happen in Parliament next week?
It's a big week with the big event right at the end of it on the Thursday. It's going to be that autumn economic statement. You know, the date for that has been moved around a lot, but we're pretty sure it's going to happen next Thursday. Being softened up quite a bit by the Chancellor already with the difficult economic background, that there may be things like spending cuts and more tax rises to help us get the economy back on track. So going to be politically quite a difficult thing to square with Conservatives as well. So interesting to see that.
Yeah, a lot of speculation about the balance between spending cuts and tax rises, and it looks like this could be the defining moment for Rishi Sunak's new government. Susan, thank you very much indeed. Well, that's all for Politics UK for this week. Joe will be back with you on BBC Two at 12:15 on Monday with Politics Live.